We are in week 2 of COP30. That's the 30th International Climate Conference to try and avoid climate catastrophe. This time is different, though. Ever since the Paris Agreement in 2015, these summits have been used as a platform to warn of the dangers of overshooting a limit of 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And each year, the slogans have become more desperate. In 2021, UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres warned that tougher action would be needed to keep 1.5 degrees alive. At the 2023 COP, he said this.
Our planet is minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit.
But if in 2023 we were at 1 minute to midnight, the clock has now struck 12.
The truth is that we have failed to avoid an overshooting above 1.5 degrees in the next few years.
That was the message from Antonio Guterres on the eve of COP30, meaning this is the first climate summit which has opened with a UN General Secretary admitting defeat. Right? We're not going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So how do we adjust to a world where climate change isn't a future risk that can be avoided, but rather is something we are already dealing with in the here and now? And does the politics of climate change need to radically shift to deal with the reality of 1.5 degrees warming? And well, those are questions posed in a new podcast series from Planet B and the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative called Overshoot. It's hosted by climate policy expert Laurie Laybourne, who I spoke to earlier today.
I think the starting place is would change the story, basically. We have stories that are often about winning or losing. They're binary stories, and they're not working out anymore. They don't make sense, because when it's clear that we have not stayed below 1.5, which was often framed as a moment that we had to aspire to not hit to save the world, then the implication is that the world is lost. We have lost. What does that mean? And a lot of people who work in the climate world, I think, are struggling with that right now, that the binary story of win-lose has started to break down because it's clear we didn't win. So a starting point is to have different stories, ones that aren't based on a either or win-lose construction, and instead have stories that are more suitable for this current moment. And in the podcast, our way of thinking of that was to use the analogy of a ship and the storm. There's a binary story before you hit the storm, you're sailing towards it, of we've got to not go in that storm, and there's a win-lose outcome. And if you didn't manage to do that and you end up in the storm itself, the story has to shift to something that's less either or, that's more about navigating, that's more about working your way through that emergency situation that you have ended up in. And I think that's a critical starting point now when it comes to this climate and ecological emergency, is we've got to have these stories that are much more about navigating what is now coming, and not about whether we've won or lost.
In the analogy, we haven't managed to avoid it. What does that, I suppose, how does that inform how we should think about climate? What does one do when they're in the climate storm as opposed to trying to avoid it?
To stretch this analogy as far as we could plausibly and politely take it, we went and spoke to some champion sailors, which was a very interesting experience. And through the discussions we had with them, we identified a bunch of capabilities that I think now are particularly important for what comes next, right? One of them, unsurprisingly, was storytelling. If you're a sailor and you end up in a storm, you've got to have a story to make sense of the much harder condition you're now in, and what you need to do to stay the course. Another one is that you need to become much more resilient, to be able to handle the things that are happening in the literal and figurative case of the climate storm for us, right? So societies are extremely vulnerable all over the world. Even wealthy countries like Britain are very vulnerable. And we still don't really have a politics of, I would say, outrage at how governments have failed to adapt. Well, we didn't until recent events where places around the world, in Europe, have been hit by extreme climate-driven shocks, and the failure to adapt has been brutally, at times, tragically exposed. And that has led to outrage and a type of politics, but it's been the exact opposite of the politics that we might hope for and that we need. In the case of the Valencia region, which was hit by extraordinary floods just over a year ago, that climate-driven disaster ended up boosting the prospects of climate-denying politicians who used contorted arguments about how the floods were made worse because of environmentalism, messing around with rivers and so on. None of that was true, but what it does is show that there's a particular risk that's starting to emerge now, one that we call derailment risk, which is that the consequences of climate change could create all sorts of crazy conditions that actually frustrate our ability to act. That's the equivalent of being a sailor in a storm and being so busy handling the impacts of the storm on the boat that you fail to be able to navigate. So that's a particular strategic challenge that is now becoming more serious, that will only get more serious, that can be dealt with, but is not being thought about or spoken about enough among governments, other key institutions who play a crucial role in dealing with climate change.
So this idea of derailment risk, you're sort of on track to doing something about climate change, but then an environmental disaster comes along and that boosts opposition to climate action. It's a somewhat sort of confusing mechanism there. What's going on? What is this argument that climate disasters can cause politics to move in an even more anti-climate direction?
Yeah, it seems paradoxical. And it basically is a situation in which there is so much dislocation and anger coming in the wake of disasters that populations, probably weren't even told were possible now, because this thing is playing out much harder and sooner than we expected. In that anger, people want someone to blame. And they look around and they look at the people in charge who they already have very low levels of trust in. And they see that effectively those people fail to keep them safe. And then there are other politicians over here saying, yeah, well, we have also been warning you not to trust these people. We also think that they're feckless. They then deploy a false argument that is often bolstered by misinformation that makes that paradoxical claim. So in Valencia, the argument was that the climate fanatics of the European Union and the central government in Spain are more interested in protecting river ecosystems and to do that by demolishing dams, that it led to a massive increase in the river flow that then caused the disaster, right? There's a bunch of local context there. There's a whole set of politics in Spain about dams that go back to the Franco era, right? None of that was true, but it seemed to make sense when you don't trust the people in charge, when they look feckless. And in the case of Valencia, when they did mess up the emergency response. Trump used a similar argument, actually, after the LA wildfires. He said, this wasn't to do with climate change. The reason why this was a disaster was because of feckless Democrats who were more interested in protecting a niche fish species called smelt and stopped the extraction of water from rivers, which meant that there was no water in the fire hydrants to then put out the fires, right? So what's happening there basically is these climate delaying or denying politicians are better at exploiting the political opportunities that come in the wake of disasters often than pro-climate politicians. And there are going to be more climate disasters. So there's going to be more opportunities for this to happen in the future.
So your argument is that sort of better preparations need to be made by politicians in favour of climate action to avoid such a thing. And I suppose in general is the argument that sort of chaos is not very good for climate policy and that sort of stability is probably preferable.
I don't think climate politics, like pro-climate politics, is ready to deal with the chaos. I think that's more the thing, because there are huge opportunities in chaos, right? If you look back through history, some of the most extraordinary advances for, progressive causes have come in the context of, in the wake of disasters, right? In the UK context, on the left, we often valorize the extraordinary moment of national renewal that occurred in the wake of the Second World War, right? And it was the crisis conditions of the Second World War, which smashed to pieces existing power balances and, had a massive impact on reducing inequality and so on and so on and so on, that enabled that moment of rejuvenation. At the moment, I don't think that some segments of climate politics are wanting to even face up to the fact that chaotic times are here and will only become more severe, and to develop a politics of being able to navigate through that chaos and, exploit the political opportunities for driving the case forward. At the moment, it looks like actually that those who are more prepared to exploit crisis moments for their own political gain are those who want to actually hold us back on climate change. And that creates a doom loop, right? Because then there's less climate action, which means climate change will get worse, which means there will be more chaos and more opportunities to exploit that to derail climate action, and you get stuck in a vicious cycle. We need a type of politics now that's very alive to, wants to admit the existence of that chaos in the first instance, and then have strategies to be able to navigate through it and ensure that we have these succession of turning point moments that can exploit the opportunities born by crisis.
So maybe a kind of eco-populism, Zach Polanski style, perhaps. Let's talk about another aspect of sort of how climate policy might change if we're already in the climate storm. And as far as I understood it, sort of from your podcast, is an idea that sort of we should prioritize technologies that are both important for adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And you had as an example the passive house in California. So when there were those sort of dreadful fires in the Palisades in California, it was the case that sort of you had thousands of homes burned down, and then there was one home, among the hundreds that stood standing, and it was a passive house, which had been built to be fireproof, but had also been built to be incredibly energy efficient, or I think they might be energy neutral. So you've got a piece of architecture which is both adaptive to climate change and mitigates climate change. I suppose, talk about the passive house. I suppose I'm especially interested in why it was fireproof. And then also, are there other examples like this? Is this something that's scalable?
The passive house one is amazing, right? So the first thing to say is that often in the climate world, people talk about needing to decarbonize, to mitigate, to use the word you use there. And then adaptation of making things harder is often seen as the sort of a slightly separate thing, our backup plan, because the best form of action is to actually deal with the problem at source by reducing emissions. In many respects, that's correct. But we're now in an era in which we need both. And ideally, they need to come together, and they can. And the example of this passive house in LA shows that. And basically, many people build these passive houses to reduce their energy consumption and their emissions and to save bills. A win-win-win, right? And the way that the passive house works is that it's more sealed than other buildings, which means you're better able to control and sustain the temperature. Well, it turns out that's the way you seal the building also stops cinders getting in, including into the roof spaces at the top, which my understanding is often where these fires that we see in North America and other places spread very quickly. The cinders get in through the roof area and then set light to things inside, and the whole house goes up. So because it was more sealed, it was more protected against that. So you then got a fourth win, a win-win-win-win-win, because it wasn't just more energy efficient and had lower emissions and made the bills lower for the family who lived in it. It was actually better adapted as well. And we now need a principle in which that design occurs across society. And yes, there are many other examples. They're not just technological, some are ecological. So if we were to do even more to restore nature, it won't just mean that we have a more thriving nature, that is good for us, our health, both mental and physical as people. It also helps reduce emissions because better restored nature can suck down carbon. It also, the fourth win, means we're better adapted. So at the moment, UK farming is taking a hell of a beating from weather extremes. If nature was bolstered, it would probably be able to handle that better. For example, I was talking to some organic farmers in Devon at the beginning of the year, and they have been restoring their soils that had been previously depleted by the previous tenants of the farms. They've been using regenerative farming techniques to improve that soil, and they basically don't get runoff on those fields anymore, compared to the farmers nearby, where if you drive past on a wet day, half the field has disappeared down the road. And it's not, again, just this sort of material things. There are ways of organizing society that will simultaneously reduce emissions and make us better adapted. Like, for example, taking care work seriously will ensure that we've got people doing jobs that, are much lower carbon and support lifestyles that might be that case as well, while also being better adapted for when societies are getting beaten up by climate extremes and need a lot more care going around, basically.
Let's talk about Bill Gates. Bill Gates, one of the world's richest men, has been a leading voice in... Has he been I suppose it depends on how you consider the climate movement. He's been a leading voice in one form of climate movement, I suppose, in terms of climate politics globally, let's say. Wrote a book about it, very into sort of green tech. He wrote a memo at the end of last month, which has, I suppose, upset a lot of people probably. So it said this: unfortunately, the doomsday outlook is causing much of the climate community to focus too much on near-term emission goals, and it's diverting resources from the most effective things we should be doing to improve life in a warming world. Later in the memo, he went on to say, although climate change will hurt poor people more than anyone else, for the vast majority of them, it will not be the only or even the biggest threat to their lives and welfare. The biggest problems are poverty and disease, just as they always have been. Understanding this will let us focus our limited resources on interventions that will have the greatest impact for the most vulnerable people. So Gates sort of has said that his change of heart is in part due to the fact that sort of there have been technological innovations, which means that we're on a better trajectory when it comes to climate. And he also says it's because of the decline of aid budgets from Western nations. So Trump and actually Keir Starmer as well. He didn't name check him, but sort of we should include that in there. And he justified his position on CNBC.
If Greta Thunberg is reading this and saying to herself, my goodness, he seems like he is reversing himself, what would you tell her?
I'd say, wasn't the goal here to improve human lives? And shouldn't we, in our awareness of how little generosity there is to help, measure, should we get them a measles vaccine or should we do some climate related activity? And if we stop funding all vaccines and that, saved you 0.1 degree, would that be a smart trade-off? That's the kind of question we have to ask. So I'm a climate activist, but I'm also a child survival activist.
What did you make of that from Bill Gates? Is he getting used to overshoot politics, or is that sort of the opposite?
I mean, I think that this is a version of overshoot politics that's emerging, right? Particularly with people who are cowed by or emboldened by the politics of the current Trump administration. One of the issues here is that when you read the memo and indeed some of the things that Gates has said in the past, it seems that he has this mental model, this understanding of climate change that's largely based on the immediate consequences, the stuff you see in the news, right? Which often is happening, say, in the tropics. And when you look at that, and then you also think about climate change largely as about the global temperature rise, then I can kind of see how you get to where Bill Gates has got to. But the problem is that the real threat from climate change, really, the thing that we should be really worried about is then the domino effects, right? So it's not just a case of, this will, impact child mortality in the tropics. And because all of this renewable tech is getting cheaper, actually, it's not going to be as bad as we thought. It's that those effects will domino around the world and could actually lead to situations where entire systems could fall over. He's also not talking there about climate tipping points, these moments where entire parts of the climate system will effectively break. This is the equivalent, we told this story in the podcast, this is the equivalent of kind of what was happening in the Cold War with the threat, another existential threat, which is nuclear weapons, where a lot of people going around, including the UK government, the US government, basically telling a story like nuclear bombs were just bigger bombs and they would fall on the cities and, unlike the Nazi bombs, they would blow up the entire city in one and there would be fallout, which would be a problem for where the prevailing winds went. But other than that, in the countryside, particularly in America, which is huge, you'd be able to crack on. And that was part of this apparatus of kind of justifying the tensions in the nuclear era, right? Of building up massive stockpiles and so on and so forth. That image was that story was largely smashed to pieces by the realization that there could be a nuclear winter after a full-scale nuclear war, where the domino effect of all the pollution and soot ejected by the nuclear explosions and the subsequent fires would then get into the atmosphere and block out the sun, and there would be basically a destruction of the food supply and mass famines for those who were unfortunate enough to have survived the initial wave of the bombs. With climate change, often people are falling into a similar trap of basically just looking at the first order impacts, the climate equivalent of just thinking that nuclear bombs are just, bigger conventional weapons, basically. And if you're in that kind of situation, then you probably don't think climate change is one of the premier existential risks. And then you end up in the kind of situation that Bill Gates finds himself in there. And, kids who, the threat that the things he's talking about there are going to be impacted hugely, mortality, child health, the list goes on, right? When there's massive global food shocks resulting from a multiple breadbasket failure, which we know the chances are increasing markedly as a result of climate change, right? Child health is going to be massively impacted if the main Atlantic circulation collapses, which we can't rule out this century, and could disrupt the African monsoons. The list goes on. So he's the impression is he's just sort of living in this very old school, very limited understanding of the threat that we face now as we go over 1.5 degrees. And presumably, he's worried about what the Trump administration will do to his foundation and other things.
I suppose one problem or doubt I have here is I think either you think of climate change like Bill Gates does, which is sort of one among many problems, sort of it will be difficult for people in poor countries, but they've got other problems anyway. I think he thinks it will be relatively manageable for people in rich countries. You're saying he's ignoring these terrifying tipping points that could be on the way. And I think if we're thinking about terrifying tipping points, I'm just not sure that passive houses or some nature-based farming are going to get us there. And that's why, I've talked about this on the show before. I think it probably is time to put some proper research into geoengineering. If it looks like a tipping point, it's going to be around the corner. Because if it looks like a tipping point, it's going to be around the corner sooner than we expected, then sort of saying, well, let's do passive houses and plant some trees, it's not going to be enough. So what does your analysis of the risk of tipping points tell you about what kind of solutions we should be looking towards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the context here is that I have done a lot of work on these things and have had the great privilege of contributing to the two global tipping points reports that were released over the last few years, one in 2023 and one in 2025. And we are in a situation where we don't really have a toolkit for how we handle these risks, which I think are materially different to kind of your routine climate change, as it were, as you're inferring there, right? In some ways we do. We know that we need to reduce emissions much faster, and the potential collapse of the main Atlantic circulation is the latest and arguably one of the greatest reasons to reduce emissions really quickly, right? I think that there are a lot of no regrets adaptations and resilience measures that we should be taking, right? So, for example, if this Atlantic circulation were to collapse, it means the UK could face colder extremes that are very bad. We're talking, some of the analysis has shown reductions of winters where we're getting like -15, -20, maybe more. Better insulation in this country and the restoration of nature would help somewhat in bolstering against that situation, and we should be doing it anyway. And it would also be something that we wouldn't regret doing, even if this Atlantic circulation didn't collapse. But yes, these are global scale risks that really cannot be allowed to manifest. And so we need some kind of emergency toolkit to handle them. And geoengineering, so-called interventions directly into the climate system, maybe they could be part of that toolkit, right? But that requires some serious research and investigation into whether they actually could plausibly work. And then, of course, a way of doing all of that that has proper accountability, that doesn't encourage us to continue to pump out emissions and not undertake rapid decarbonization because we think we'll be able to pull this tech lever. And let me just give you a very quick example of a scenario, a sort of a subset of the overall Atlantic circulation. This is the circulation that means the UK is warmer than it otherwise would be. It's one of the reasons why we have vineyards at roughly the same latitude that Canada has polar bears. A subset of that overall circulation could tip much sooner than the full circulation, right? It could then have a domino effect where it weakens even more the full circulation. And then suddenly the world faces a critical action moment where it's got to handle what's going on. In that situation, it's unclear for me at least, what the kind of emergency geoengineering intervention could be. This is a circulation that is being weakened partly by the melting of the polar regions. And so maybe some intervention that's stopping that melt by reflecting sunlight would help, maybe. But really, this circulation is based in the abyssal depths of the ocean. Is there an engineering intervention that can be made to keep that circulation going? I don't know. Are people working on that? We need to try and explore what these possibilities could be. And we don't have a concerted effort that would have to be done from across a number of governments to work out what our emergency toolkit is, because we do now face these kind of planetary scale emergency situations. They're now plausible scenarios.
And is that, I mean, let's actually, my last question actually was going to be on the UK government. The UK government, I think, is probably leading the world in terms of investing in that kind of technology. They're also trying to reduce carbon emissions. Are they an example to look to in terms of navigating climate change in a world of 1.5 degrees?
There's a lot to praise the UK for. Because of those things that you just listed there, and the program that you, I think, were alluding to there is the bits of research that a strategic R&D arm of the government is investing in, both on exploring the research agenda for geoengineering, and there's another program that's looking at how to develop early warning systems for certain tipping points being triggered. and that does coexist alongside the emissions reductions program and the move towards a decarbonized electricity supply. Yeah, all of that, particularly the emissions reductions, are still not fast enough to be compatible with reducing the risks in the future, and so that's an area where ideally we would be going much faster, and we'd be doing it in a way that talked even more about justice and so on. I think that one particular concern from my perspective is that climate change is still not a premier security issue in the government. Now, by security there, I don't mean defense. I mean the way that COVID made us think about security. That our security, the collective stability and ability for our society to flourish is dependent on the secure functioning of our economy, our communities, our food supply, the list goes on and on, right? COVID stressed that. It created what government called a whole system civil emergency. Climate change could be a driver of such whole system civil emergencies in the future through food shocks, through financial crises, and so on and so forth. That version of the climate threat is still not the one that is prevalent in governments around the world. The UK government is an example of that, though there is some increasing realization of this. And I think it's only really until it is up there with the very top threats that the government sees the country being faced with that we're actually going to get the kind of action that we need, not just to reduce emissions, but actually to, this is the crucial thing, be able to navigate through what is coming next, to make sure that we are simultaneously able to remain resilient and in doing so, be able to focus on reducing emissions and playing our part in making sure that happens globally, because that is the only way that we'll have a chance of navigating out of this literal and figurative storm of a climate crisis.